Triage. Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I do know there's a doctor speaking next door, so I appreciate that you chose this talk instead when I'm just some guy. I'm doing a PhD in philosophy if you want to talk about that after, but it's totally unrelated to any of this stuff. So I'm super grateful to be here because as you can tell from my progression, I am not a developer by training. And so my advice to you, if you're in the room and still in college or anything, is to major in computer science and not in IT like I did, because trying to backfill object-oriented programming is like a nightmare. And so really, this journey, though, is I think what we're seeing more and more, it's definitely what I've seen more and more, of people who started in systems and sort of get into cloud and start realizing like, oh, this is all just code that's happening. Like there's no more just Ansible getting as nerdy as it gets, but you are starting to declare things as code, get into Terraform, and then from there, you're just one step away from importing some Python stuff, and now all of a sudden you're a developer. And so really this progression is why I want to talk about threat modeling triage as far as how do we manage in this world where everyone is becoming a developer, whether you're a help desk person, you're starting to write Python scripts to automate things, and DevOps deploying changes quickly. How do you do it? And one thing I want to do before we get started is I wanted to just play a quick game. I know I'm going to talk before lunch as well. Can you raise your hand if you're part of a company that's under 10,000 employees? And then keep it up. And this is like the age game. And then I want to keep going down to like 5,000 employees. Put your hand down. 3,000 employees, put your hand down. 2,000 employees, put your hand down. 1,000. 500. I'll start dropping fast because I heard a sigh, so I think there's probably a 1 somewhere around. Okay, but that's good. I just wanted to get an idea of, I think a lot of threat modeling history is from these big companies that have defined the field and really driven it to where it's gotten. And we'll talk a little bit about how most companies, I think, are beginning to encounter it earlier. But really, I'm grateful for the smaller companies here where we're really strapped on resources. It's hard to think about what does threat modeling mean in this context. And so the companies I've been a part of, Very Good Security is a startup in San Francisco. We built a compliance automation project that was meant to compete with Vantadrata. You know those names, but not ours for a reason. But then I went with ReliaQuest as well, which is a big security provider, and that gave me an opportunity to work with a lot of different companies to improve their security posture. And now I'm at PagerDuty, which is my favorite way to describe PagerDuty is what people tell me all the time, which is that it's their least favorite app on their phone. So hopefully we can do better. So the agenda today, we want to talk about the problem, talk about prerequisites to the problem, and then create a framework for triaging and what we hope to do. And so first, the goal of threat modeling from the Threat Modeling Manifesto is that it's analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. And I want to focus on a system because really, in today's world, systems are changing faster than you can update your threat model. And we see this with, we'll talk about the scope of PRs and the number of things that are changing, but really the dream of threat modeling is this driver-navigator model, right? Where we want, as security people, we would love nothing more than to be able to sit next to every developer and be an angel on their shoulder, hopefully, or if we're role-playing the attacker side, the devil on their shoulder, telling them, hey, did you consider this? Did you build this? And we really want to drive all of those changes, but obviously, there are many problems with why can't we do this. And the first problem is that we just don't have enough application security or security practitioners in general. And I thought early on that this was an issue to do with like funding more than anything. I thought maybe if we just had enough money, we could hire enough application or security people. But really, I've just learned that there's just not enough people who are interested in security in general. I remember being at a security company, I put out a call saying, if you're interested in being a part of our Security Champions program, let me know. I put it out on Teams, on email, Slack. Like I thought I was going to get flooded with responses. Instead, I went to like different managers and directly asked them. No one responded. And I found one developer out of 200 developers who cared at all about security. And I had to drag them kicking and screaming eventually onto our team, but really it just got at the issue of that this ratio that happens isn't just a funding problem, it's a getting people interested in security problem. And these illustrations are just to point to the fact that that small ratio feels really good when you're doing the annual trainings, when you have everyone's attention for their mandatory compliance training. But if you're trying to review every single pull request, you're going to just end up in a chaotic nightmare of a time. And the second problem that I found is that existing threat models are too in-depth for small teams trying to handle a high velocity of change. If you just Google threat modeling and sort of stumble your way into it, you'll come across Stride. And if you're trying to like do Stride over multiple PRs, like you're gonna have a real heck of a time trying to do it. And I just wanted to illustrate part of the reason for that is that Stride was created in 1999, and I know I'm getting old because I can remember using Office 2000, which normally for a long time when I heard these talks, I was always like, oh yeah, that's some system I haven't used, whatever. But Office 2000 I've used. And just thinking about the pace of change, just to use it as an example, of there's been 23 releases of Office just so far this year compared to those old service packs that used to get out. And so the pace of change is too heavy if you're trying to use a heavy model on every single change. And the third problem is that we stumble into threat modeling. And so these are all real examples that I've been a part of how a threat modeling program starts at a company. The first one, when I was a cloud security engineer, I was asked as part of a SOC 2 audit for our change management procedures, which then included how do we do threat modeling was in there, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, we're supposed to be doing threat modeling. The second was the SOC is asked for a list of all their risky endpoints, and so all of a sudden you need an asset inventory, you need ways to think about like, oh, are those publicly accessible endpoints, are they not? The compliance team asking if the tabletop exercise that they do counts as a threat model. And really we're seeing more and more just compliance-driven reasons to have a threat modeling program. And then finally is the one that I think we're probably all familiar with, where all of a sudden product says, oh, we have the mobile app launching next month, and then security finds out about it, and then you're trying to like scramble to get on top of like, how do we threat model this change that's happening? And so the problems in some are that there's not enough people to do threat modeling. The models are too in-depth, it's not a planned priority, and so how do we get meaningful risk reduction with our limited time? And so what I'm suggesting first is that we nail some prerequisites to getting this done, because if we try to just stumble in and start doing threat modeling, we're going to end up with some issues. And then second, just a quick lesson learned on diagramming that I have, and then third, the actual triaging that we'll talk about. And so first, the prerequisites to really doing threat modeling well is the first most important thing, and I love the CISO at Stackhawk talks about when you're trying to achieve shift left in general, it's not just a technology issue, but it's also a people and a process issue. And this first one is meant to get at the people part of this, which is the part that we're so eager to overlook because we want to dive into tools and dive into models and start coding stuff. But really, if you don't have a relationship with product as a security team, it's going to be impossible to make headway because you're just constantly smashing up against the walls. And that product relationship can happen really anywhere. So if you're a security engineer, if you just ask other developers what they're working on and try to go alongside them and contribute code meaningfully to a project, that's one way that you, even though you're not an executive, right, is the thing that comes to mind, or like management, directors have to talk. If you're just an engineer, you can still build those relationships to ask the questions like all of a sudden, oh, well, we do have that public-facing SSH server that we all forgot about. So really building those relationships is the first step. But then second, the thing that I found is that you have to have a way to do service ownership. And this part is also something I've tried to like brute force my way over, where we have a list of 150 microservices, and maybe 75 of those are not owned anymore because they're like different forms of legacy or there's different issues with them. But of course, when you do a threat model, go figure, those are going to be a lot of the risk are in those old services. And so you have to really prioritize who is going to actually fix the things once the threat model is done. Because if we don't have ownership, then we just have this threat model where it's like, all it's good for is waving our hand, once a breach happens 3 years later, saying like, oh, look, we flagged that endpoint 3 years ago, but we didn't actually do anything about it. And so it's important to establish that. And part of that is a top-down alignment on the priority of security. And this speaks to your ability to talk about security as a business problem and not just as like a technical problem where you are driving product value in the things that you're bringing to users as far as how you're increasing the security and driving revenue. And finally, the secret to funding that I found, I've never had an easier time obtaining funding for these types of programs than at an organization where we adopted as an org the framework that we were going to use. And so we used the DevSecOps maturity model, the DSOM, as well as the SAM, sort of. But the way in which we said every quarter we want to score higher on this maturity model. And so it made it so that when it came time to get funding for a SAST, for a DAST, for an SCA tool, whatever it was, we said, well, we committed as an org to increasing our score on this maturity model that we should be doing. And so it was no longer a question of what's the value that this brings, because as an organization, we already committed to the maturity model. And so we were able to get funding that way. And so I found that to be an extremely helpful way to both speak to executives and to obtain funding for our different initiatives. So first, I remember when I plugged, and it's not shown up too well up here, but that's a diagram of Uber's microservices. And I remember when I got Prisma Cloud for the first time, I was excited because I was like, oh, I'm going to be able to diagram our cluster and see what's happening. And then I got something like this happening. And it was like, okay, well, that's not super helpful. And so really, all I want to emphasize is that when you go, you're going to have a lot of hopes about diagramming for the first time, as well as diagramming services. And if you try to do it in an automated way, looking at like your Datadog diagram or whatever, it's going to be just this complex, unusable nightmare of a thing. And so really what you need to do is work with someone like an application architect to do something that's more helpful like this. And I remember how intimidating it was for me to go up, because I was a junior-ish security engineer, and I had to meet with the chief architect of an application to have them like walk me through how the application worked, and he was the only one he could do it. And he had a thick accent, and he brought the whiteboard out and just started like scribbling how everything happened. And then I just took a bunch of pictures and notes and really had my mind blown. But it's important to swallow that fear of not knowing how things work in this simple way, because every single time I've ever had diagramming happening, I've always received the feedback, wow, I didn't actually think about this, I didn't know how this worked, I was overlooking this detail. And so just building a clear logical diagram like this one is, of just something simple where it's focused on the data flow, which we've talked about a lot, of like, here's the phone number, here's how it gets encrypted, here's where it's stored, and here's how it gets back to the user. Like, just something that allows you to really see the external and then where internally you're storing it, really allows you to simplify instead of these giant, more technical diagrams. So finally, how do we triage this on-ramp of change? And the goal of this project was to create a minimum set of questions for new product initiatives so that we could determine the level of security attention that they should receive. And the reason for doing this, the biggest question there is why minimum? And in my experience, developers stop paying attention after about the third question. So usually, like if you have a yes, no, not applicable column, like you'll get like really thoughtful responses to the first four, and then just like not applicable like the rest of the way down. And so really, if you're trying to get something that developers are going to have to do regularly, it should really be short and to the point. And so the goal of what we're trying to do here is move from this funnel on the left of security is like this blocker of projects, we're the people who always say no because there's all these features that product wants to do, and we're sitting there and our job is to say no, to instead we kind of see at a high level all the projects that are happening in the org, and we're choosing where to spend our time based on where we can make an actually meaningful impact. And so I want to just use this example this is a real like list of priorities at an organization I've been a part of, not PagerDuty. And so we had 2 application security engineers for our team of 200 developers, and these were the product priorities. And so I want to go real quick and say, just if you think from this list that it's your number 1 priority, go ahead and raise your hand. Building a mobile app. Adding additional field parsing for Kafka. Building admin UI functionality. Switching off platforms. Implementing K8's networking changes. Adding additional rules to an endpoint agent. And service deprecation replacement. Okay. So I was curious if it would match. I think there's one in here that I thought might be wrong, and it might be based on what we did. But really, these are the questions that I've used for that minimum set of requirements. And I found this really helpful. In some orgs, I've added like, if the answer is yes to is new infrastructure required, we'll go ahead and like blow that out with a couple extra questions like, is it networking? Is it data stores? Like that type of stuff. But these 4 questions just encapsulate a way to try to add scoring to how security focused of a change is this upcoming change going to be. So is new infrastructure required is meant to catch like, are we going to have to stand up new places to ingest logs from? Do we have new public facing endpoints for users that they're going to end up being able to hit? Is user data interactivity involved? That's meant to just hit like, at the end of the day, I summarize most application vulnerabilities as like injection of some kind. And so really just any field that a user's going to be operating is really like an opportunity for injection. And so just making sure like that's all that's meant to catch, is if it's going to be a net new field for someone to interact with. Third, are there any changes to cryptography, authentication, or networking? And I'm cheating with this question because it's like multiple questions. Cryptography is to make the compliance people happy, but I've never seen a bigger foot gun than cryptography for people, because it's like, it's this thing where if you don't do any, it's bad. If you do enough that you're just like, give me the latest like from Amazon, like yes, I'll encrypt, then it's like good. And then if you start writing your own, it's like, oh, we're back in bad territory again. And so it's like this delicate wave of like, we just want to make sure we're doing like what everybody does. Let's not invent new stuff. And then authentication is obviously just the big catch of it's really complicated, it's always a nightmare, but it's also where we as security can provide the most hands-on value as far as just asking questions like, do you use Argon 2 ID? Because a lot of devs will be like, oh, salt and pepper. And just like it creates there's a lot of confusion, and it just is an opportunity for us to bring simplicity there. And then finally, protected data, just as a way of amplifying our attention to this thing. So if we apply these 4 questions to that list, here's what we end up with. And so the UI functionality is the debatable one, which I'll take the L on maybe. But as far as definitely switching off platforms is definitely where we want to consolidate our time, right? Like that's obviously going to be a giant threat modeling exercise as far as like, what's the data flow like? Where is it changing? How are we transitioning users? Are they opt-in, opt-out? Just a ton of questions that's opening up. I didn't see a lot of people talk about the building a mobile app one, but I do think that that's an area where you suddenly have access to a ton more user data when you've deployed out to this new area of maybe your team's never built on an OS before, and they're exploring that for the first time. Or like a real example that I can use is we found out that one of our development teams, the product manager just went and bought some iPhones and a Mac Mini, and they didn't want to pay for cloud GitLab runners, and so they were just running the GitLab pipelines off the Mac Mini somewhere in a foreign country. And so like that's an example of the kinds of stuff that's happening when you're doing new things that you're going to want to be able to catch. And then finally, I only saw one person raise their hand on the network changes, so good shout out. I think that's a huge potential issue, right? This is how when someone says, oh, I just did the easy thing and I accidentally opened everything up to everything. And so the other benefit that I want to raise with these questions is what we did was partner with the DevOps team, because the other team that's understaffed, always getting like the funnel effect, next to security is DevOps, as far as like they're getting asked to support all of these changes. They come out of nowhere, like the Mac Mini story, like some dev just went and bought a Mac Mini. They didn't, instead of asking the team like, oh, should we set up AWS device farm, and what does that look like? So really, it's an opportunity to bring DevOps in early with you. And so security and DevOps, or SRE, or whatever you do for like general infrastructure management, can sit in on the change requests as they're happening and get an idea early on of like, Security wants to know if there's new network changes, but so does the DevOps team, because they also have to plan for that change. And you can design the architecture together from a very early stage if you do this sort of triage together as a team, because they're going to want to know a lot of this stuff too. And so finally, the results of this should be first, that security gets to take a step back and be involved in every major project roadmap item. And that's because what you've done is essentially created a funnel, not in the old way where you're just saying no to every PR, but you've made this quick triage process of like, you can ignore all the stuff you don't care about, like product wants to add some new field parsing for something they're doing, like who cares? You get to be involved with all of the big projects that are really going to demand a ton of both product engineering effort, and really have an idea overall of like where the product's going as a whole, as well as the architecture. And second, it means that your job gets to be early on helping developers architect, instead of just saying, oh, you did this wrong, oh, you did this wrong, oh, you did this wrong. And you get to actually partner early on, which just brings a ton of benefits. And finally, I found that developers really have a hard time with the gray area of compliance. Like everywhere I've ever been, when the answer is like, well, do we have to encrypt this field? And it's like, well, it's a complicated question a lot of the time. And really, the fact that it's a replicable, scored methodology goes a long way to increasing developer adoption, because they're able to actually understand and see how things are being generated, and understand the methodology behind it. And so, with that, we can move to Q&A. Oh, not launched yet, sorry. Yes.
Yep. Thank you very much.
I don't know if this is validating, hilarious, frightening, or okay, boomer, you've been around too long. But your list of questions is almost precisely the questions we came up with at IT's insistence, wait for it, in 2004-05 at Cisco. So, or has it just been around too long, these same problems? I'm not sure, but I just wanted to say, oh my God, those are the same questions we had up there to try and do exactly the same thing, triage, because there were too many projects to engage in. So I don't know if that's validating or anything, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's validating and speaks to like the stuff that people, like even finding that 1 to 100 number is really hard to find anywhere. It's the stuff that like people don't brag about. So like the big companies will like put out this giant white paper methodology thing because it's like a bragging right. But like to find that 1 to 100 number, I had to listen to a lot of like AppSec talks from like different like Meta, Twilio, Google people like talking about how they're doing it, and then like, oh, this is normal, that it's really hard to hire and it's 1 to 100. And same with like Cisco didn't put out that 4-question list, and it's like, this is the thing that's like super useful for most people because the big thing they're not gonna do. So. Another question?
I'll wait for the mic.
Sure.
Okay, I like the questions. They're great. How do you actually get connected in? Like, how, in other words, a lot of times this dev happens, like you said, they say, oh, by the way, we're releasing the mobile app next month. So, it would be great to get those questions answered sooner so that you knew to do those reviews. But how do you get them to tell you sooner that they're going to be doing a mobile app?
So it's like the people and process entry points. For the people entry point, if you're an engineer, it's essential that you commit a pull request somewhere. Like developers just won't listen to you or respect you or answer to you unless you've committed code to like their project, which is it's also an important learning process because you're not just like hypothetical land, you're like getting hands-on with like here's what they're actually dealing with from a process standpoint. And if you're not on the technical side, one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen a compliance leader do was ask a VP of engineering to be their mentor, which is just like, oh, that's so smart. To just, because everybody wants to be a mentor, like who's gonna say no to that? You're just the sweet, innocent person. But you're like, getting that relationship is so essential. And then on the process side, that can be a little bit harder depending on how mature the organization is. But for the different places I've been, whatever like the early design phase of product is, you're just making that questionnaire. I've used like Google Forms for it or whatever, as just like part of that design checklist is like fill this out. But the more natural relationships, obviously, the better that it goes.
All right, do we have any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, those 4 questions again. I'm just curious if you've had people try and kind of weasel their way out of having to answer yes to them by taking
Yes.
technicalities, and if you don't end up with like a 4-page document explaining what each question really means in the situations and things like that.
Yeah, that's where definitely have had some of that, and the having like optional be a thing. Like if it's like no, make it like no and, so that they can do some sort of comment that's there. Like I always tried to push people towards like not applicable as opposed to no, because that way you'll get a little bit more information from them in terms of like, if you ask if new cryptography is required, they might say like not applicable. Oh, because we're designing our own. And so, yeah.
All right, anyone else?
Over here.
Okay.
Yeah, so just wondering, if you're doing prioritization, right, which is great, what happens to the rest of the things, right? What kind of attention do they get, or what kind of processes do they go through?
Yeah, I almost said none, but that's me being flippant. The actual answer is like, that's where your like automated testing stuff comes in, like your SCA, SAS, whatever, scanning stuff. Because it's really just focused on like, where are we really gonna like focus our manual like relationships and be a part of the design meetings and be a part of the creation stuff. But then like the automated stuff is handling the rest of it.
All right, last call for questions. All right, with that then, thank you very much.